Hello, thanks for spending some time with me today. I'm Brian Curran, Vice President of Customer Experience Strategy and Design at Oracle. And I wanted to talk to you today about how expectations, your customers' expectations, actually should drive your strategy on how you engage with those customers. Now, before we start, let's kind of ground ourselves in some really important things. First of all, if you're going to have a customer experience strategy, you need to think about two things. First and foremost is your customer and their needs. And then if you are fulfilling those customers' needs, then you are actually going to drive the results that you want to drive. So those are really the two basics of your strategy. But the question is, how do you actually drive those results? Well, in order to drive those results, the first thing you need to think about is your customers' behaviors. You want to drive behaviors if you want to drive results. And if you want to drive behaviors, what you really need to think about is, how do I drive customers' attitudes? Because the way we think is the way we behave, and ultimately that drives those results. So a quick example on this is that if you're trying to drive conversion rate, what conversion rate really is a behavior is just getting people to press the buy button. So why don't they press the buy button? Well, the reason for that is that they're probably not confident that they're making the right decision. So what you need to think about is, how do you drive confidence that gets them to press the buy button, that drives conversion rate, that actually drives revenue? So how do we think about that? What we need to think about is, we have to actually define an engagement strategy. How are we going to engage with the customer? And that's what drives experiences, because experiences really just are the perception of how I feel about the engagement we had. Now, there's one thing that's important to understand about our experiences, that we actually have expectations about what that engagement is going to look like. And those expectations frame how we feel about that engagement. So in other words, those perceptions are framed by our expectations. Ultimately, those two things, the expectation and the experience, influence how we think and ultimately drives behavior. So what I want to talk about a little bit with you is that, how do you think about these experiences? First and foremost, you want to drive really three types of experiences. The first one is about being useful. It has to be a useful experience, because the customer came to you to achieve something. And if they don't achieve that, then your experience isn't even useful. So that's kind of the first foundational piece that you need. After it's useful, though, it needs to be usable. You have to think about that. How much effort do I have to put in order to actually achieve what I came to do? If it's complicated, if it takes a lot of time, if it requires a lot of thinking, then it's not easy for me to do business with you. Ultimately, though, what you're trying to do is drive meaningful experiences. Experiences that hit me at an emotional level, that make me feel differently about you, your brand, and whether I should continue to engage with you. And ultimately, these two experiences are really about thinking about those functional needs and those emotional needs. So what we're trying to do now is, that perception, that experience, is really driven, right, by my expectations. So we really need to understand expectations and how they work. Now, all of us have expectations, and they're driven by many different factors. If you think about it, if you go to Amazon one day, and then you turn around and go to another company, and you had a great experience with Amazon, but you don't have such a great experience with the next company, why? It might be because Amazon actually set your expectations about what an experience is supposed to look like. So customers come to you, lots of different customers come to you with all of these expectations. And if you think about it, the digital world has driven these expectations even more, right? I expect you to actually be available on my mobile phone. I expect you to have these following capabilities. I expect you to be able to quickly put something in a search box on your website and find the answer. Why? Because others have driven that expectation. So what you need to think about is, how do you drive your strategy so that it's actually meeting customers' expectations? Now, I spend a lot of time with companies around the globe, and a lot of them have really great strategies. The problem is, the customer's expectations look like this, and most companies' strategies look like this, and there's a gap. And that gap is getting bigger and bigger as customers' expectations are increasing because of this new digital world. So what you need to think about is that, well, what is customer expectations, and how do you get to the point of understanding how to deliver that? Because these are beliefs about the impending engagement I'm going to have with you as a company. And you have to get your hands around understanding what those aspects mean. And there's really four factors that drive those expectations. First and foremost are all the things that are going around in the macro environment: political, economic, social, technical, legal, environmental. All of these things come into play as I'm thinking about my expectations. The other piece of this is just got to start thinking about context. Context is the thought process about, well, where am I? Who am I with? What am I doing? What's the weather look like? All of those things drive my expectations. If I'm engaging with you by myself, I might expect one thing. But if I have my children with me, I might have a completely different expectation about what I want. So that context is very important. The other thing you have to think about, there's all this historical engagements that I've had with other companies. We've talked about this before with Amazon. Those play a key role. And my geodemographics, who I am, or who I think I am, or who I aspire to be. The economics focused around me may drive what I expect from you as a brand. So to kind of give you a way to think about this, what I'd like to do is use this persona. And a lot of you are focused around millennials right now. You're thinking about, how do I engage differently with millennials? Because their expectations are not the same as people like me, baby boomers. I may expect one thing from your brand, but millennials are going to be completely different. And I'm raising millennials, so I understand how crazy this thing can be. But if I start thinking about the expectations maybe of a millennial, and I want to give you some examples, these are not all the examples, but give you some examples of that. So if I think about permission, these people think differently, millennials think different about what kind of permission they're willing to give you and how they're willing to share data and how it's used. So where we might be a little bit more buckled up about what data we want to share, if you're a raising millennial like me, you notice that on social sites they share a lot more data than I would ever share. So their thought process around permission is going to be completely different. But they want to make sure that you're authentic as a company and you're focused on delivering value with the data that they give you. They want you to make it personal. It's not about being this big mass group of people, but they want you to think about them in a very personal way. Don't build a strategy just for some big segment. Build a strategy for me, for Brian. Then all of a sudden I'm thinking differently about how I want to engage with you as a brand. You've got to think about mobile, but don't think about mobile like a device. Think about mobile like mobility. Understand that the millennials are going to be all over the place, very busy, running around all the time, and you have to make your engagement move with them. You have to think about their lifestyle and the experiences that they want, and make sure that you're meeting those expectations of being mobile, going with them during their lifestyle. You have to think about time in a different way, is that you have to be precise. There's a lot of noise out there. And people are being bombarded with all of that. And so when you engage with a millennial like Daniel, you have to think differently about being on time. We use a lot of words like proactive and predictive and all those. That's not what I'm really talking about. What I'm talking about is that if you want to engage with Daniel, you have to be very timely about making sure it's relevant and you're delivering it at the exact moment that really matters to him. Channels is not about this omnichannel, multi-channel strategy. What we're really talking about channels is you finding the appropriate way to engage with that customer at the moment. That Daniel's going to want you to understand that, well, I'm here at this moment and more than likely I'm going to have my mobile phone use that. Ooh, I'm here at my office, we should be using X, and so on and so on. You have to think completely different about that. And then the last piece of this is that you'll see that a lot of the millennials are very aspirational about their thinking. They want to make sure that you understand what their goals are for the future. This is why you see a lot of information these days around millennials about saying, well, wait a minute, who are you as a company? Are you authentic? Tell me about your social responsibility, all of those things. You have to understand that these experiences have to be meaningful to Daniel if you want them to actually matter. So, once I kind of have these expectations, what I need to start thinking about, okay, how do I go from expectations, this is what my customer expects from my brand, to defining my strategy. And what we're talking about here now is aligning those. If you have these expectations, you need to align these strategies. So let's start thinking about what those could look like. Okay, there are a number of different strategies that we could use. First and foremost, maybe we need to think differently about how we actually think about customer journeys. We have to think about the step-by-step process that a customer goes through as they're starting to drive the fulfillment of their need from your brand. Don't think about that every piece of that journey is actually with you. It may be a number of different competitors and influencers and trends and things that are coming into play, so you need to make sure that you understand their journey. For instance, when I go on a trip, I may deal with an airline, but I also have a hotel to deal with, and I may have other different things that I need to deal with. You need to think about that as a holistic journey, not just the piece that I do with the airlines. The second piece of this thing, what we need to look at is that if there's an entire journey that the customer is going on, there's an ecosystem that's involved. So like I talked about before with the airlines, is that you have to make sure that you understand that if there's an airline and there's a hotel and there's a travel company and there's a taxi and all those pieces, it needs to come together like one single ecosystem. So your partners may change as you try to drive your strategy. The next piece of this is you've got to have a completely flexible business model. You might have a way that you're doing business today, but you might have to think differently about it if you want to actually deliver value in the future. And so you may drive revenue this way, or your cost structure might look this way, or the activities, resources, all that may look a certain way now, but you might have to have flexibility in order to meet the new expectations of the customer. The next piece you need to think about is that insights is actually the crucial part. It's the data that really matters here, is that you have to understand the details about me, Daniel, and the step-by-step journey I'm going on, and collecting all of that information so that you can actually be relevant at the moments that really matter for me. If you don't know who I am and you don't know what's going on, the chances of you being relevant and making your way through all of that noise of other people trying to get my attention is pretty slim. So the data here, the insights, are crucial in order to deliver the kind of experiences that you want. Now, if you want to deliver the kind of experiences to Daniel in a relevant way, you've got to think about empowerment in a different way. Every single person in your organization who interacts with Daniel has to be empowered. They have to have the right tools and capabilities and data and information so that they can have that relevant engagement. Your experience is only as good as your last experience. And so if a customer had a great experience for you, but then they engage with someone who doesn't know who they are, who doesn't understand the whole journey that they've been on, the good chance that they will actually not deliver the kind of experience that you want. And last but not least, obviously I've got to think differently about if I've got this data and I have this information, I've got to be on target about when I actually want to communicate. So I've got to communicate in a way that actually makes sense. I've got to think about the timing of those engagements. I actually have to define the strategy. If this happens, and then this is going on, now I want to interact with the customer. Think about my strategies and align them along that way. So, in closing, what I really want to say here is this, is that you have to really start to understand who your customer is. You have to understand the journey that they're going on. You have to think about the expectations they have of you and your brand along that journey. And then you have to align and define your strategies in order to engage with the customer. And if you do that, you have a much better chance of being relevant, driving the kind of thinking that you want, the attitudes you want, driving the kind of behaviors that you want for your customer, and ultimately delivering the results that you want. Good luck. Thank you.